Well, we'll just allow folks to join as they can. I'd like to welcome everybody again to our 2021 webinar series. I'm Lisa Smith, the Executive Director of NAA, the Natural Areas Association, and I'm delighted that you're here joining us for today's presentation. The purpose of the NAA webinars is not just to convey important science, methodologies, and best practices that inform what many of you do on the ground, but to engage you all in these conversations. And so to that end, I encourage you to participate in the webinar by posting comments and questions in the chat function, which I think we're all pretty adept at using by now. I'll be tracking these questions in chat as we go through our presentation today, and then we'll make sure we have ample time at the end to get your questions answered. So for those of you who are new to the NAA, in case you don't know, we are a national nonprofit membership organization that is dedicated to the support and advancement of natural areas professionals, those who work to protect the world's important natural places through science-based management, stewardship, and advocacy. So we've been doing this work for over 40 years, and we support it through, we support you in your work as natural areas managers by bringing you the latest science in a number of ways. We publish the Natural Areas Journal, which many of you are familiar with. It's a peer-reviewed quarterly publication, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. We host the Natural Areas Conference. Our 48th conference will be held in Duluth, Minnesota in October of 2022. So be on the lookout for emails and visit our website for more information as that conference continues to be planned and developed. It's going to be a good one. We have what we call stewardship and action programs. These are 1 to 2 day on the ground field-based workshops focused on issues that are important to managers. These are more intimate opportunities for managers to come together and learn from one another. We have 3 of those planned for the second half of 2021. So again, check out the website and be on the lookout for more information on those. For a long time now, we've been hosting the State Natural Areas Program roundtables. These are discussion forums for, but not limited to, our state agency members. This has been a long-time conference tradition, but we are holding these roundtables virtually now, and we're doing them more frequently. So around about 3 to 4 times a year, we will convene our State Natural Areas Program roundtable members, and we invite everybody to participate in those. Be on the lookout again on the website for more information. One initiative I'd like to just bring up is our newly formed Science Advisory Committee. The Board of Directors of NAA established the Science Advisory Committee, which is comprised of some of North America's leading authorities on the conservation of biological diversity. The committee has been put into place to advise the board and staff on developing critical issues related to all aspects of conservation of natural areas. So for those of you, again, who are members, you'll be seeing more of the benefits of this effort coming your way in the next year or so. So hopefully we will be publishing more white papers, position papers, and just providing more information on big questions that many of you are asking these days. And then we also, we have these webinars, these monthly webinars that we are using to put good science in front of you. Just like this one today. So let me just catch up to my slides here. If you are not a member following this webinar, you will be receiving an email with a 7-day trial membership. The trial membership will not only provide you access to the recording of today's webinar, but it'll also allow you to view all of our member resources, including our webinar archives for the 2020 webinars and past issues of the Natural Areas Journal. And for those of you who may decide to become members, individual membership starts at $79. It includes access to all of our programming, including a digital subscription of the Natural Areas Journal. And if you pay to participate in today's webinar and you elect to join, your membership fee will be credited the $29 you paid today for your webinar. So that's a $50 membership in that case. Okay, so the 2021 webinar series is offered on the third Tuesday of every month at noon. The next one is April 20th, and it's communicating the impact of our work or your work. This webinar will be presented by Beth Brodowski of Irish Strategies. And Irish Strategies is a partner of the Natural Areas Association, and they've done a lot of great work with us to help us in the realm of communicating the importance of our work. So I highly recommend you can give this one some consideration. It's a little different than others that some of you may have participated in, but it's also something that any communications staff in your organization or agency may be interested in participating in. So please do spread the word. And with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter for the day. Today's webinar, Current and Future Carbon Storage Capacity in a Southeastern Pennsylvania Forest, is being presented by Dr. Jessica L. Schedlbauer, professor of biology at Westchester University here in Eastern Pennsylvania. This work that Jessica is going to present to us today was published as a manuscript in the October 2020 issue of the Natural Areas Journal. We've made that manuscript open access, and so I'll be providing the link to that manuscript in the chat once Jessica gets started with her talk. I'll be sure to put it there. Jessica has a master's degree in ecology and environmental sciences from the University of Maine and a PhD in natural resources from a joint doctoral program between the University of Idaho and CATIE in Turrialba, Costa Rica. She had a postdoctoral appointment at Florida International University before beginning a faculty position at Westchester University of Pennsylvania. Her principal research interest is in carbon storage and cycling, and she often works at the interface of terrestrial ecosystem ecology and plant ecophysiology. Jessica's research, which has spanned a range of ecosystems from the tropics to the Arctic, addresses research questions relevant to ecosystem management as well as climate change. Jessica's current research is centered around the deciduous forest ecosystems of Pennsylvania. Jessica, welcome, and I'll invite you to go ahead and take over slide sharing.
All right, thank you, Lisa, for the introduction, and thank you also to the Natural Areas Association for the invitation today, and thanks to all of you for being here. Okay, so to get started, I asked Lisa to build a couple of polls to assess essentially a little bit about who you are, where you're coming from, what your background is like. And so Lisa, if you would launch those polls, I think that would just be really helpful as we get going so that I can get a sense of who's here and what your interests are to hopefully tailor things a little bit. So I know that as you're voting, you usually can't see this. We've got about half from the Northeastern US, 10% Southeastern, 34% Midwestern, 5% Western, and 3% outside of the US. That's great. Okay. Thank you so much, Lisa. That's really helpful. Okay. So I'm really hoping that you find the ideas that are presented in today's seminar to be helpful in thinking about forest management. I'm really interested in making sure that the research that I do is well connected to sort of the interests and the needs of the management community. So we will go ahead and get started. And as Lisa said, this is a paper that was published in the Natural Areas Journal last year, and it's work that I did in collaboration with one of my students here at Westchester University. So the citation's down at the bottom. So in terms of my research interests, I'm really interested in how different types of ecosystems interface with the carbon cycle. And since arriving in Pennsylvania about 11 years ago, I've been really interested in studying how our really highly fragmented forest landscape in the eastern United States contributes to or perhaps detracts from terrestrial carbon storage, because this is something I think a whole lot about, and it's something that is so deeply intertwined with issues related to climate change. So to give you some contextual information, we know that globally temperate forests represent 14% of standing forest carbon stock. So that's both above ground and below ground. And these forests also represent 30% of forest sink capacity globally. And so if you think about that, we're talking about really enormous potential to mitigate some of the negative effects of climate change because of this high carbon storage potential that exists within temperate forests. As many of us are aware, our forests in both the northern and the northeastern United States are relatively young. This has to do with the history of land clearing for both timber extraction and agricultural use historically. And so research that's been done relatively recently indicates that the majority of our forests in the eastern United States are less than 100 years old. And historically, we think about these quote unquote young forests as being ones that have a very, very strong carbon sink capacity because they're young, they're actively growing, and that's traditionally how we've thought about them. On the flip side, our older forests, so we might be talking mature forests, we might be talking old growth forests. We obviously don't have a lot of them left in the eastern and northeastern United States, but there has been this assumption, I guess is the way I would put this. There's been an assumption in the literature that these forests have kind of maxed out in terms of their growth potential. So they've either plateaued or they're in decline when we're thinking about how much carbon they store. But there's actually accumulating evidence recently in the literature that's demonstrating that these older forests can continue to be persistent carbon sinks even as they age. And so that is a really, really different way of thinking about these forests, and it might kind of help us to rethink how we may choose to manage those forests going forward. All right. And so if you put all of that together, you think about these young regrowing forests and these older forests that still persist on the landscape, you do have the potential for quite a bit of climate change mitigation just because these forests are so good at pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it long term. All right. One of the things that I think is really important is considering what it is that we need to do as scientists, as practitioners, to actually maintain the sink capacity of these forests, to make sure that these forests remain as ecosystems that are capable of storing carbon over the long term. And I would argue that this point that's up here at the top is really important. We need to maintain structural complexity in the forest, and we need to maintain diverse understories, specifically populated with native species, right? That, in my opinion, is a harder task than it has been in the past because, as many of us are aware, these are forests that are just beset by change. And I would argue that the forces of change that are acting on our deciduous forests in the United States are really different from what they've been in the past. And those changes have largely occurred over approximately, I'd say like the last century or so. And so there's a partial list here of some of these agents of change. Some of them are biotic, some of them are abiotic. The first one, and there's some debate about this in the literature, but it's the loss of fire from the landscape. I mean, I know we don't historically think about eastern forests as having been super fire dominated, but there is some evidence that it was an important part of these landscapes historically. And as we have excluded fire as a disturbance from these ecosystems, there's also been this climatic shift towards decreased drought frequency and increasingly wet conditions throughout the eastern United States. So we're talking about changing abiotic conditions here. And then there are three other things on this list. These are all really significant biotic changes. So the loss of American chestnut, which has occurred within the last 100 years. And, you know, very often people are thinking about chestnut as a keystone species, that its loss has really dramatically transformed these forests. I would love to have seen what one of these looked like back in the day. We also know that we've got an enormous problem with white-tailed deer. So we have high herbivore populations because of lack of predation and the way that we manage our landscapes large scale. And then we've got increasing problems, which you can see illustrated in the picture at the bottom with the introduction of non-native invasive species. Okay, so if you think about all of these things together, what I want to point out is that the suite of conditions that are influencing forest successional processes right now, they are really different than they were 100 years ago. And so we need to have a think about that if we're interested in making sure that ecosystem services and carbon storage capacity are maintained in eastern deciduous forests long term. So the work that I'm going to tell you about today, this is a case study, which is something that's important to keep in mind, but I worked in Southeastern Pennsylvania, approximately where that star is located on the outline of the state to your left, and we're in the Piedmont upland. There is some climatic data here for this portion of the state. I'm from upstate New York, spent a lot of time in New England. And so Pennsylvania, Southeastern PA strikes me as mild winters, really hot summers. We've got pretty even precipitation spaced out throughout every month of the year. The picture on the bottom is one of the sites it's one of the plots that I worked in as part of this study. And I just want you to kind of take a note of what the forest understory looks like here. I feel like this is increasingly common in some areas. I often describe the forest understory as looking kind of park-like. There's not a whole lot going on in the understory there. All right, so the site that we're going to be talking about, it is called the Gordon Natural Area. It is a protected area on my university's campus. And it is a forest fragment. It's been a forest fragment for quite a long time. The image on your left is from the first set of air photos that were flown in Pennsylvania in 1937. And you can see the forest fragment here. The portion that I'll be talking about is approximately what I'm circling right there on the left. And you can see that in 1937, it was surrounded mostly by agricultural land. And by 2018, the university had moved in with sports fields over to the west, and then much of what surrounds it, in addition to a highway on-ramp, is just suburban development. All right. One of the things that I want you to notice here in the image on the left, there's this area that I am tracing right now. And what you'll notice, this is an area that's about, it's a little bit more than 8 hectares in size, but you'll notice that the canopy looks really different there than it does throughout the rest of this fragment, particularly the areas to like the north and to the east. This is an area that we are fairly certain was clear cut around the turn of the last century, so sometime around 1900. Trees that we've cored in this area at about breast height, they're about 100 years old. And then when you move out here, where you see the more diverse canopy structure and less uniform tree canopies, these trees, the oldest ones out here, date to about 200 years old. So what you're going to hear me talking about is the 100-year forest versus the 200-year-old forest. And this was, even though this is a really small forest fragment, it gives us this really nice opportunity to compare forests of different ages and think about long-term carbon storage in these ecosystems. The research questions that we set out to answer here, first one is, has above ground carbon storage in living and dead tree biomass increased over a 5-year period? And do these changes vary with forest age? And so we're going to be looking at data from some permanent plots that I've established that I census on a 5-year rotation. The second question, how have forest structural parameters changed over a 5-year period in both the 100 and 200-year-old forests? And then third, is current forest structure and composition likely to support future carbon storage capacity? So that's what we're going to be exploring with this data set. Really briefly, our field measurements were pretty standard. We worked in 3 extraordinarily large plots in each of these forest areas. So we had 3 0.2 hectare plots in both the 100-year-old and 200-year-old plots that were recensused. Well, they were censused in 2013 for the first time and 2018 the second time. So that's the data set that we'll be looking at. We measured all trees down to a diameter at breast height of 10 centimeters. And so that's what you see in the image on the left. We use those data along with tree species data to figure out above ground carbon storage using allometric equations that were relatively recently published. And then over on the right-hand side, you see some of our coarse woody debris data collection. So we also measured all standing and down deadwood in the plots. And we didn't use a line intercept method because I only census these plots every 5 years. We went out and we actually measured everything in these plots down to 10 centimeters. So time consuming and kind of backbreaking, but I think totally worth it because you get a really good data set out of it. And so to process those dead wood data, we ended up using decay classes and volume reductions to calculate the amount of carbon stored in our dead wood pool. Okay, So we're going to dig into the data. The first thing that I want to do is orient you to the figures that we're going to be looking at. And so the first one is living tree carbon storage. The second panel is down dead wood. And then the third is standing dead wood, because you might expect those pools to be decomposing at slightly different rates. The left-hand side of each of these graphs is going to show you data from the 100-year-old forest, right-hand side 200-year-old forest, and then the white bars are 2013, the gray bars are 2018's data. And the units on all of these graphs are megagrams of carbon per hectare. So you end up with some fairly large numbers here. So what you'll notice, the first thing that you see with the living tree carbon data is that the over bars that are right here, the lowercase a and the lowercase b, those indicate that there was significantly higher carbon storage in the 100-year-old forest relative to the 200-year-old forest. That's what that difference is telling us. And then as part of the analysis, we also looked at the temporal component, the time component. And so the capital A and the capital B are indicating a significant increase in living tree carbon storage in both the 100-year-old forest and the 200-year-old forest. All right. So a really, really important point to make here is that we're seeing substantial carbon storage in both of these forests that is increasing over time. All right. So that's kind of key point number one. What I will point out with our deadwood pools, both down and standing, we don't see any significant differences either for forest age or this temporal component that we were looking at, which isn't too surprising when you look at the data, given the size of our error bars. There's lots of variance in these data, and so we're unable to detect any patterns there. What I will point out, though, the information that I've put over here on the left-hand side of this slide, there was a compilation study done by McGarvey et al. In 2015, and what she did was compile data from throughout the mid-Atlantic United States for remaining old growth forests. And so the data that I'm reporting here, this is above ground carbon storage and dead tree carbon storage. This is the average and the standard error in megagrams of carbon per hectare for forests that are essentially a good representation of like where these forests are going to top out, what the maximum amount of carbon storage is that you might expect. And so if you're looking at the plots that are over here on the right, we're very much in range if we're looking at above ground carbon storage, but the dead tree carbon storage is much higher here than what we're observing in our plots. And that suggests that this is something that's going to accelerate relatively rapidly in the near future, especially because we have a lot of older stems, which you will see in a minute. I've also got carbon storage data broken down by diameter at breast height class. And so those classes are what you're looking at along the x-axis on the bottom. And then again, we've got living tree carbon storage on the y-axis. And what I will point out, we're just going to go over here and look at these trees in the largest diameter class. The increase in carbon storage that we observed over time, so from 2013 to 2018 in both the 100-year-old sites and the 200-year-old sites, was really driven by what was going on with these large diameter trees. So in digging into the data, we find that this pattern is driven both by increased girth growth, but also increased number of stems entering that size class. All right, so that's largely what's driving the pattern that we saw on the last slide. The other thing I want to point out to you, though, is what's shown over here, like these small diameter classes, there's definitely something going on here. We see significantly higher carbon storage in the 100-year-old plots, regardless of year, than in the 200-year-old plots. That shows up in the two smallest diameter classes. It's also echoed in the third smallest diameter class, even though that is not significant because of high variance. And so that, when I saw that, I was like, oh no, like something very strange is going on here. This is not what we would expect. And so one of the questions that arose was, what is it that's going on in the 200-year-old forest? Because these numbers are incredibly low. So to start answering that question, we took a look at some more structural information. So on the left is stem density and on the right is basal area. And what I will point out in the stem density figure, you see significantly higher stem density in the younger forest relative to the older forest, no changes through time. And then in terms of basal area, we see the exact same pattern that we saw for above ground carbon storage, which is not surprising at all. Okay. What I will tell you at this point is that a dive into the literature showed me that the above ground carbon storage and the basal area data for the 200-year-old forest, those are exactly where you would expect them to be for comparable forests of, that age. The thing that is really different is this very, very low stem density, right? And so what's happening in this 200-year-old forest? These are the stem density data broken down by diameter class. Again, these are the same diameter classes that you saw before. And the main thing that I want to point out with this figure is that there's significantly higher stem density in the 100-year-old forest. So that's what you see here and here compared to the 200-year-old forests. And again, that pattern is echoed in like the third diameter class over here. So largely these trees over here, the majority of these trees are in the understory. They're all overtopped by other trees. And what this is telling us is that we have a substantial regeneration problem in the 200-year-old forest, even though it is adjacent to a 100-year-old forest, right? Like there are a bunch of things that this is telling us, but this is really a red flag. So this makes me worried about things like future carbon storage potential in the 200-year-old forest, because the assumption is always that there's going to be plenty of stems that are available to repopulate the forest as older canopy trees die. We do not know right now what is limiting regeneration in the 200-year-old forest, because the pressures on these two sites are identical. They're right next to one another. You saw this on the figure that we started with. And it's possible that because we have so many trees in these large diameter classes out here, and not very many of them have been dying, as is indicated by our small dead wood pool, we don't have very large canopy gaps opening up, and we may have small canopy gaps that are being infilled by lateral fill rather than like the vertical height growth of trees. So that may be part of what's going on here. So I'd suggest we have a regeneration problem in the 200-year-old forest. One of the other things that I wanted to look at is what this data set might mean if we start digging in and looking at the tree species that are physically present on the site. So what we've got here, all of the figures over on the left-hand side are for the 100-year-old forest. On the right, it's the 200-year-old forest. And for this figure, I've broken down the data into 5 centimeter diameter classes. So they start at 10 centimeters and they go up a little bit over 80. And on the y-axis is number of stems. The y-axis is identical for every single one of these figures except for this one, because we had an extraordinarily large number of stems for this particular species. Okay. The data that you're looking at, what I did is I pooled everything. So the 3 plots that exist for in each of these forest age classes, they're pooled. So this is the total number of stems in 0.6 hectares of land area. So it's a relatively large sample. And these are our 8 most common species. So the top 2 panels, this one and this one, this is Norway maple, which is a non-native, so it's tagged with an NN. Then we have red maple. We have the carious species. The hickories have been bulked because we were not able to sample leaves for all of them and identify them to species. So they're here at the genus level. This is beech, white ash, tulip poplar, red oak, and then, white oak and then red oak. All right, so these are our 8 most common species. There were 16 species total, but most of the other ones were relatively rare, and you'd see, something tiny on the graph. So we're focusing on these. What I want to point out here is really the difference between the stems that are in the canopy versus the stems that are in the understory. And you'll notice that in the 100-year-old forest, we've mostly got a canopy that's dominated by tulip poplars and by red oak. If we flip over to the 200-year-old forest, we're looking at a slightly more diverse canopy, but not dramatically so. So there's some hickories that make it up there, some beech, tulip poplar again, and then a few oaks make it up there. That's kind of what our canopy looks like. Very much a tulip poplar oak type system right at the moment. If you look at the understory, the question is like, what are we anticipating in the future? What's coming up? We see quite a lot of Norway maple in both sites, the 100-year-old and the 200-year-old site, a little bit of red maple, maybe a little bit of hickory, quite a lot of beech. Beech is really abundant in the understory. And then after that, maybe some tulip poplar in the 200-year-old forest. What I am anticipating looking forward is very likely a less diverse, more homogeneous forest over time. That's what I see when I look at this data set. We are seeing some evidence of a widely reported phenomenon in the literature that's often referred to as forest mesification. So as forests get increasingly wet, we start losing the oaks, and we're starting to see the rise of species like species in the maple genus, and beech, and some hickories, which is exactly what we're seeing in the 100-year-old forest, and we're seeing that a little bit in the 200-year-old forest. So that's a fairly dramatic change, and I do want to point out that when we usually talk about mesification in forests, we talk about red maple, but we also talk about sugar maple. In this instance, we're talking about the rise of a non-native in these forest understories, which is something that I'm pretty significantly worried about, because if you do some digging into the dirt on Norway maple, what you find is that it is, I think everybody knows this, right? It's an extraordinarily good competitor. It can outgrow native species in terms of height growth. It can make it impossible for native species to establish in the shade underneath these tree species. It is highly resistant to deer browse. And actually, if you look at all of the trees that are proving to be successful in the understory, they, for the most part, are tree species that are known to have a pretty high resistance to deer browse. They're unpalatable. And so what I would point out is just that, like, you've got these forces acting on the forest to really change the shape and the direction of the forest in the future. Okay, so I'm gonna quickly get to some conclusions, and then we can talk more about this if you would like. But it is worth pointing out here that both of these forests, regardless of age, continue to accumulate carbon over time. And so this is another piece of evidence in that pile of evidence suggesting that both younger forests and older forests have significant carbon storage capacity. In this particular forest, there's a fair amount of uncertainty about whether intervention is probably going to be necessary to maintain carbon sink strength in the 200-year-old forest, because we've got such limited regeneration there. The fourth main point is that rise of Norway maple in the understory is very likely to limit native regeneration. And I think that is a really important point, because if you think about all of the pressures on these forests and all of the agents of change that are acting on these forests, one of the things that you want to do to protect against those pressures is to make sure that you're maintaining native diversity, because that enhances ecosystem resilience to change. And so if you get an aggressive invader like Norway maple in there that starts shifting the tree species composition, that to me suggests that you're probably going to find yourself in hot water, whether it's 50 years or 100 years down the road. But that's really something that we need to be paying attention to. If we have forest understories that are being colonized by Norway maple, we might want to take a look at that. And does that mean that we do some targeted girdling? Does that mean that we do some underplanting to increase the potential for regeneration in some of these forests? So those are the main conclusions that I wanted to share. I've got some acknowledgements here. There are a number of students that helped out with this work. My contact info is down there if anyone has any questions, but I'm happy to take questions now.
Well, thank you, Jessica. This is great. Let's move on to some of these questions. I see there are more popping up here, but I'm going to try to go in order. So, to your point about Norway maple being an invader of this particular forest, these particular forests, one of the questions that got raised early on, and maybe this question did get addressed, but I think it's worth bringing up again. Can you talk a little bit about, aggressive exotics pulling more carbon? And, just that whole idea of, what role invasives in the understory do play in pulling carbon. Are they effective at it? Are they not effective at it?
Well, all right. So there's some tension here, because this is a really good and really, really tricky question. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to say this about Norway maple in particular, because we've got some physiological work going on with the species right now. It's really good at what it does, right? So it's incredibly good at growing well in the understory and sequestering carbon. It's very good at it. And so if we're thinking about that objective of storing more carbon, maybe that doesn't necessarily pose a problem from that perspective. But I always go back to these issues related to, I mean, this is why I brought up the idea of ecosystem resilience at the end. We know that one of the things that's really critically important for making sure that an ecosystem is resilient in the face of change is maintaining the biodiversity of that particular area. And so that's genetic diversity, it's species diversity, right? It's the whole suite of things. And so if you get an aggressive invader in there that's capable of maybe taking out half of the native species because they're not good competitors with it, and Norway maple can outgrow it, I think that that is going to long-term pose a problem for carbon storage potential because you have reduced the resilience of the ecosystem. And so like there is tension in that issue. Yeah.
Sure, that makes sense. And we can't be thinking about this in just carbon storage in isolation of every other benefit of diverse forests.
Right, of course.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Okay, John Taylor asks if Fraxinus americana, the American ash, was abundant in the 200-year-old forest prior to the emerald ash borer. Sorry.
So we are in an area where emerald ash borer is just arriving. It was first noted in a park that's right up the street from me. I shouldn't be smiling. A couple of years ago. And so we have largely not lost our ash yet. We've also partnered with the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources to do some experimental biocontrol release in this particular forest. But that's not part of the equation here yet.
Good to know. Good to know. Okay. Just a comment from Patricia Quigley. Your conclusions seem to match what us working biologists have seen over the years, that deer and invasive control are key factors to control natural regeneration.
Yeah, and I think turning our attention towards understory regeneration, just as scientists and practitioners, is really an important point to be thinking about, because, you know, you're often looking up at the canopy. And I think, you know, it's really important to assess what's going on there and what your regeneration potential actually looks like.
Very good. Thank you. Roger Latham asks, how much is known, if anything, about how younger and older forests may differ in underground carbon storage?
That's a really good question, Roger. We just started measuring carbon storage in these forests, so we don't have any data yet. We know neither of these sites has a plow horizon, so they were definitely not tilled for agriculture. So we're hoping that we're doing litter collection and we're doing soil carbon analyses in these plots going forward. And so that's something that we're hoping to address in the future.
Okay, great. And related, Stephanie Bradshaw asks, what was root mass considered in your carbon calculations, and how would root mass vary between 100 and 200-year-old forests?
We didn't do that math because the way that this usually works, because we have such a poor understanding of all the things that we don't see that go on with trees underground, is that carbon allocation to roots is usually just a proportion of above ground biomass and carbon allocation. And so if you were to do that math, you would just assume that it was proportional to what you're seeing above ground. And that's not very satisfying to me. And so we didn't include that in this particular study.
Okay, I'm going to keep working my way through here. We're getting lots of good questions. John Taylor asks, were light levels recorded in plots for both forests?
We did not assess understory light availability. We're actually in the process of doing that now. So current research that we have going on is we're assessing the three dominants in the understory and looking at how they respond to things like sunflex and things like that. And so part of that work is characterizing understory environments, and we're not finding real significant understory differences from place to place.
Okay. Okay. Okay, we asked about root mass, and we're going to come back to invasives here in a quick minute, but well, let me just ask that question so I don't lose it. Aside from the Norway maple, were there any other invasive exotics present
There
in the
were.
forest?
They're relatively infrequent. So we do have Polonia in the canopy. We have Tree of Heaven in the canopy. We have some areas where Amber honeysuckle gets large enough that it like sizes into our understory age class. So those are the other ones that are around, but they're nowhere near as abundant as Norway maple.
Okay, Luke Hamilton asks, can you talk more about the yearly carbon storage of 100 and 200-year-old forests and how much the storage capacity differs?
How much it differs?
And we can ask Luke for more specifics on that question if needed.
Yeah, I think I'm a little hazy on is it what's driving it, or is it how, like the size of the difference between the two sites in terms of the increase?
Okay, Luke, why don't you answer that question and we'll come back to you.
Oh, I just saw, he said he was interested on a yearly basis.
Okay, there you go.
Sure. Well, I mean, you could look at the first figure that I showed. I'm going to take over screen share again, Lisa.
Go for it.
The first figure that I showed, this one right here. So the panel that's up here on the top, this is broken down, like these are snapshots. And so if you were to divide the increase by 5, it would give you annual data. And what you're looking at is a real dramatic increase in the 200-year-old plot. Like, so we're seeing greater annual carbon accumulation in those plots. And like I said before, that's due to both ingrowth into those larger diameter classes, but also girth growth of those 60+ centimeter diameter trees. Yeah, so greater growth, but lower starting point to begin with, which is interesting, which makes me wonder about the like longer term history of these plots.
This may be related. Do you know if age size specific rates of growth are increasing in any of these species? CO2 or nitrogen dependent enrichment effects, I think is what Donald Waller is asking there.
I mean, I don't have the data to look at that specifically.
Okay.
I mean, the assumption would be that, yes, you're seeing some CO2 fertilization effect, assuming that the trees are not bumping up against some other kind of limitation like nutrients or water. And probably initially, my guess is we're probably still seeing some fertilization effect in these forests.
Okay, great. Rosemarie Mazika asks, what are your thoughts about relative carbon in the forest floor of these two areas?
We measured it in 2018. It's not included in this paper because it's our first time assessing that, and there are no differences between the two sites. And one thing that I didn't mention as an agent of disturbance is that we've got significant non-native earthworm issues in these forests, which, you know, they're just tearing through the leaf litter.
That's an interesting factor to consider, my goodness. And do the soil types differ between the two forests? It's a related question.
Very slightly, but not enough that, you know, not enough that I would expect that to influence something like nutrient storage or rates of carbon accumulation or sort of like the protection of organic material in the soils.
Very good. Very good. Charles Barreca asks if the herb/grass communities in the the herbaceous layer of the forest is, you know, how much is that does that play into carbon storage? Is it a significant factor? Little.
We almost never quantify it because it's such a, I mean, it's important for so many reasons, but from a carbon storage perspective, I mean, we even ignore trees below 10 centimeters in diameter because they're such small contributors. Important for asking structural questions, important for things like, you know, resource provisioning in the forest, but we don't look at it for a carbon storage perspective.
Okay. Okay, I think you've a couple people have asked that question related to that, or related questions. Okay, here you go. Jeff Johnson, do your data support forest management to include some sort of cutting regime as being better than long-term preservation with the goal of obtaining old growth, mature woodlands?
Well, that's a tricky question. Because the thing is, I mean, I'm an ecosystem ecologist, right? And so from my perspective, dead wood in a forest stand has quite a lot of value. And so any kind of removals that are not going to result in long-term carbon storage, from my perspective, are going to be a negative. That doesn't mean that you can't sustainably manage a forest in a way that is going to help promote long-term carbon storage and push a forest towards maintenance of carbon storage over time. But are you doing it in a way that is thoughtful and practical and low impact and not leading to significant soil compaction and damaging the understory? I am not a forester, and so I'm probably minimally qualified to comment any further than that.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. There was a question about how exotic invertebrates are changing the surface composition and regeneration in the forest, but it sounds like you're going to start paying closer attention to that as you do more forest floor work. Okay. And Ron Eckstein just asked real quick, if you could review the role of dead wood in young and old forests for carbon storage.
Well, just trying to figure out how to splice that question. I mean, if you think about it, wood takes a reasonably long amount of time to decompose because it has a lot of compounds in it that don't yield a lot of energy during the process of decomposition, in like really simple terms. And so those carbon pools in dead wood can be fairly significant, and they also end up being really important habitat for a number of different organisms, whether they're standing or whether they're down on the ground. And then as that carbon is further decomposed and turned into soil organic carbon, those are things that can linger for a long period of time, because you tend to have like decomposition of wood can result in sort of large molecules that are difficult for microbes to attack. And so I really do think that leaving dead trees is really, really important.
Okay, very good. Yeah, Julie Richberg asks the related question, can downed wood carbon storage be increased even with careful selective removal of wood for wood products? Gets back to,
I'm not sure. I mean, if you're taking the older trees and you're not cutting and leaving anything, I mean, maybe there'd be slash or something like that that'd be left on the site, but that's relatively small. It's not going to last for very long. I have trouble imagining a scenario where that would be possible.
Very good, very good. Back to the invasive plants, Aaron Maynard Bean asks if are the invasive plants similar in abundance in each of the two stands, the 100-year-old and 200-year-old forest?
I mean, the thing is, the sites, I'll just advance again to this slide. The thing is, the non-native trees that we sampled, the ones that were abundant were the Norway maples. And so they were a little bit more abundant in the 100-year-old plots, which you see here, than in the 200-year-old plots. But I mean, really, I would like to have more plots, right? I'd like to have a larger sample area. So in the sites that we characterized, slightly more abundant in the younger forest.
Okay. Aviva Patel asks if there were any conifers in these plots and if carbon storage was assessed for those.
We don't have them here.
Okay. Michael Courier asks, how many carbon mitigation forests are in Pennsylvania? Yeah.
Probably any that are growing, right? I'm not quite sure what that question means, but like, I don't know that.
Mm,
I mean, I think that sometimes that is a piece of one's management strategy. It's not always necessarily the centerpiece of one's management strategy. And so I have talked to folks who are interested in quantifying and thinking more about that, folks that work for the state, but I don't know that there's any place that we manage explicitly for carbon storage.
Okay, great. And, you know, I would invite anybody participating today, if you do know some of the answers to these questions, just can't be the expert here on everything. Do chime in chat. Feel free to help out. Let me go back to Erin Maynard Bean's question about invasives and the comparison between the 100-year-old and 200-year-old. She was referring to understory plants like Amur honeysuckle that you had mentioned, as opposed to the trees. You know, are we seeing similar abundance in both forests?
Yeah, I'm mentally walking myself through
Through.
the
It's not
forest.
not something you've measured.
It's not something that I've quantified. And what I would say, just based on my personal experience with this forest and other forests in the region, is that it's very patchy.
Okay.
And it very often ends up, another piece of the carbon cycle story that I've been working on is examining how the carbon cycle at forest edges changes relative to interior environments, and what's going on in the soil environment. And I mean, I think most people have observed this, but those edge environments up to about 30-meter depth into the forest are the ones where I tend to see the really, really heavy non-native invasive presence in these forests. And so it does tend to be patchy depending on where you are.
Okay. Yeah, it's a curious question too, just given the difference in age and also, some of the history of how those forests were disturbed, or how recently, one more than the other was disturbed.
Definitely.
Okay, here is another fire. This is another forest management question, and fire comes into it. So Danielle Frivola asks, from a management perspective, any ideas for how to limit mesofication, not sure I pronounced that correctly, to enhance carbon storage? Would thinning the forest to open the canopy be useful? Would reintroducing fire help? And then related to that is Luis Moreno asking, what would be the, is it your understanding, or maybe you don't know, what's the fire history here on this site? And, is it something that should potentially be reintroduced to this landscape?
I mean, bunch of things to figure out there. Okay, so
okay, it was I tried to combine two questions,
okay.
which might not have been helpful.
I don't know anything about the fire history at this particular site.
Okay.
I haven't ever been able to find any historical records that indicate that there was fire here. This process of mesification, though, we know that this is tied to large-scale swings in climate. And so even if we did want to reintroduce fire into the landscape to try to, for instance, push the ecosystems back towards being like an oak hickory dominated type ecosystem, that may not be possible because like the incident of drought has gone down, the amount of moisture that is being delivered is increased, the sort of amount of moisture in the atmosphere has also increased. And so you've got all of these climatic pressures that are pushing these ecosystems in a different direction, that I don't think you're going to be able to address simply by reintroducing fire, because the process of mesification also involves the accumulation of litter of all of these more mesic species, and that creating conditions that are more conducive. Again, like it's a self-perpetuating system that forms, that favors the growth of like the maples and the hickories and the beech, as opposed to having an oak dominated forest. And so the oaks just don't thrive under those kinds of conditions. So fire is a piece of it, but there's something larger that's going on here that, unless we're going to stop our fossil fuel combustion tomorrow, like I think we've got some trouble. We got some trouble with this one.
Okay, great. And then Kelsey Boyd asks the question, are there native tree species that you found are better at storing carbon than others? She's thinking in terms of tree plantings restoration. And I do want to make note that a couple of people cited a paper in chat that y'all may want to grab and download. But Jessica, any comment from you on that?
The work that I am doing at present, I'm looking at Norway maple, red maple, and American beech growing in the understory. And perhaps not surprisingly, beech just kind of putters along in terms of like photosynthetic carbon uptake, where Norway maple and red maple they crank. They do great. And they're able to take advantage of low light conditions and like short-term sun flex, and they do really well. This is unpublished, don't tell anybody. But yeah, so, maybe not planting Norway maples, but maybe planting red maples would be something that would be beneficial. There's not really, because we're doing this research right now, we've dug into the literature, and there's really not a lot of research on how understory species exploit understory light availability, and who does better than which other species. And it's like these questions were sexy for a hot minute, like back in the 80s, and almost nobody has done that work to date. And so digging into that has been a really interesting process, because I do think that that's a really important question to answer.
Okay, great. Well, Jessica, this has been a fantastic presentation, and thanks to you and to participants for an incredibly rich conversation about it. We will continue to try to offer more programming, more science on this topic. I think Jessica is a new member of our community, so we're excited to have her here as one of our scientists doing this good work. So thank you today for your time and for your efforts to present this good work that again was published in the Natural Areas Journal. Check it out. Go ahead and download the paper. I provided the link up top. And thanks to everybody. We hope to see you again at our next webinar. Stay in touch. Let us know what kinds of science is important to you and you'd like to hear more about. All right, everybody. Have a great day. Jessica, stay in touch.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.